There's a quiet kind of discomfort that builds up when your surroundings are cluttered, even if you've learned to ignore it. It shows up in subtle ways: a slight hesitation before opening a drawer, a quiet frustration when you can't find something, or a lingering sense that your space doesn't fully belong to you. Most people try to deal with this by tidying a little at a time, believing that small, consistent efforts will eventually lead to a clean and peaceful home. But somehow, no matter how many times you organize, the mess returns. It becomes a cycle that feels endless, almost like your environment is quietly resisting your efforts. The deeper truth is that tidying isn't really about cleaning at all. It's about decision-making. Every object around you represents a choice you made at some point: to buy, to keep, or to ignore. And when those choices accumulate without intention, they begin to weigh on you. What appears as physical clutter is often just the visible surface of something more internal: hesitation, attachment, and sometimes even fear of letting go. Most people approach tidying in a fragmented way. One day it's the closet, another day it's the kitchen, and maybe someday the garage. This method feels productive in the moment, but it rarely creates lasting change. That's because it never forces you to confront the full volume of what you own. Instead, it allows you to shuffle things around, temporarily hiding the problem rather than resolving it. Real transformation only begins when you see everything at once, when the sheer quantity of your belongings becomes undeniable. There's also a common belief that storage is the solution. People buy boxes, shelves, and organizers, thinking that if everything has a place, the problem disappears. But storage is often just a more sophisticated way of holding on to things you don't actually need. It creates the illusion of order while quietly preserving the clutter. You feel better for a while, but nothing fundamentally changes. The shift begins with a different question. Instead of asking what to throw away, you ask what to keep. This sounds simple, but it changes everything. It forces you to focus on what truly matters rather than what you feel guilty discarding. And when you evaluate your belongings through that lens, something surprising happens. You start to notice how little actually deserves a place in your life. There's a certain clarity that comes from holding an object and asking yourself whether it genuinely adds something meaningful to your life. Not in a practical, rational sense alone, but in a more intuitive, almost emotional way. Does it make you feel lighter, more comfortable, more at ease? Or does it carry a subtle weight, an obligation, a memory you've outgrown, or a version of yourself that no longer fits? This way of thinking challenges a deeply ingrained habit. Many people hold on to things just in case. Just in case they need it someday, just in case it becomes useful, just in case letting it go turns out to be a mistake. But just in case is often just another way of saying, I'm not ready to decide. And when too many of your possessions live in that uncertain space, your environment becomes a reflection of indecision. There's also the emotional side of clutter, which is often harder to face. Gifts, for example, are rarely kept because they're useful. They're kept because of what they represent: a relationship, a moment, a sense of obligation. Letting go of them can feel like rejecting the person who gave them, even if that's not true. In reality, the purpose of a gift is fulfilled the moment it's given and received. Holding onto it indefinitely doesn't preserve the relationship, it only adds quiet pressure to your space. Another hidden layer is identity. Many people keep things because of who they think they should be. Clothes that don't fit but represent a past version of themselves. Books they never read but feel they ought to. Equipment for hobbies they never started. These items aren't just objects, they're expectations, often unfulfilled ones. And when they accumulate, they create a silent tension between who you are and who you think you're supposed to be. When you begin to recognize this, tidying becomes less about cleaning and more about alignment. It's about shaping your environment so that it reflects your present self, not your past or your imagined future. It's about choosing what stays with intention, rather than defaulting to habit or hesitation. But this process isn't as simple as deciding once and being done. It requires a certain level of honesty that most people aren't used to practicing with their belongings. It asks you to confront not just what you own. You don't just create physical space, you create mental space. Your environment becomes easier to navigate, your choices become clearer, and your attention is no longer scattered across things that don't matter. And this is where the real transformation begins, not in the act of cleaning, but in the shift of perspective. Because once you understand that your space is a reflection of your decisions, you start to see tidying not as a chore, but as a way of reshaping your life from the outside in. But knowing this is only the beginning. The real challenge lies in how you actually go through the process without falling back into old patterns, and that's where things take a very different turn. What most people don't realize is that the way you tidy determines whether the change will last or quietly disappear within a few weeks. It's not about effort or discipline. Many people try hard, They spend entire weekends organizing, only to find their space slowly returning to its old state. The issue isn't laziness, it's the method. There's a tendency to treat tidying as something you do repeatedly, like brushing your teeth or doing the dishes. A little here, a little there, constantly maintaining. But that approach keeps you trapped in a cycle where you're always managing clutter instead of eliminating it. The real shift happens when you treat tidying as a one-time, decisive event, something you do thoroughly, completely, and with full awareness. That idea might sound extreme at first. The thought of going through everything you own in a focused, intentional way can feel overwhelming. And that's exactly why most people avoid it. They prefer smaller, manageable tasks because they feel safer. But those small tasks never force a real decision. They allow you to postpone the deeper question of what truly deserves to stay in your life. When you commit to doing it all at once, something different happens. You begin to see patterns that were invisible before. You notice how many similar items you own, how often you've made the same kind of purchase, how much you've been holding onto without a clear reason. It creates a level of awareness that gradual tidying simply can't provide. There's also an order to this process that matters more than it seems. Most people tidy based on location, starting with a room, then moving to another. But spaces can hide things. An item in one room might feel necessary, simply because you don't see its duplicate elsewhere. That's why the more effective approach is to tidy by category, not by place. When you gather all items of the same type in one spot, you remove the illusion. Seeing every piece of clothing you own laid out together, for example, creates a kind of clarity that a closet never could. It becomes obvious what you actually wear, what you've forgotten, and what you've been holding onto without purpose. The same applies to books, papers, miscellaneous items, and sentimental belongings, each category revealing something about your habits and your decisions. Clothing is often the easiest place to begin, not because it's simple, but because it's familiar. You interact with it daily, which makes it easier to sense what feels right and what doesn't. As you go through each piece, the question isn't whether it's still usable or whether it might be needed someday. The question is more immediate and personal. Does this still feel like it belongs in your life? That feeling can be surprisingly clear when you pay attention to it. Some items naturally feel right, comfortable, familiar, aligned with who you are now. Others feel neutral or slightly heavy, like something you're keeping out of habit rather than genuine connection. And then there are those that feel completely out of place, even if they're still in good condition. The challenge is trusting that feeling instead of overriding it with logic. It's easy to convince yourself to keep something because it was expensive, or because it might be useful, or because you feel guilty letting it go. But those reasons often have very little to do with whether the item actually deserves space in your life today. Books bring a different kind of challenge. They often carry a sense of identity, who you think you are or who you want to become. It's common to hold on to books you've never read, telling yourself you'll get to them someday. But in many cases, those books represent intention rather than action. Keeping them doesn't bring you closer to reading them, it simply preserves the idea of it. There's a quiet honesty in admitting that some of those intentions have passed. Letting go of a book you haven't read isn't a failure, it's an acknowledgement of your current priorities. And interestingly, when you reduce the number of, often accumulate because they feel important in the moment, but most of them lose their relevance quickly. Holding on to them, just in case, creates a backlog of information that you'll likely never need, while making it harder to find what you actually do need. As you move deeper into this process, it becomes less about the objects and more about your relationship with them. You start to notice how often you've kept things out of obligation, fear, or simple inertia. And with each decision to let go, there's a small shift, a sense that you're choosing your environment more deliberately. But not everything is straightforward. There's one category that tends to slow people down more than any other, not because it's large, but because it's deeply personal. These are the items tied to memory, emotion, and identity, the ones that seem to carry pieces of your life within them. And when you reach that point, the process changes again in a way that most people don't expect. There comes a point in this process where logic stops being enough. Up until now, you've been making decisions that, while sometimes difficult, still felt manageable. Clothes, books, papers, they all carry some weight, but they can be evaluated with a certain level of detachment. Then you arrive at the things that don't just sit in your space, but seem to hold parts of your life within them. These are the items that don't just exist physically, but emotionally. Old letters, photographs, gifts, souvenirs, childhood belongings, objects that feel less like possessions and more like fragments of memory. And this is where many people stop, or slow down, or quietly abandon the process altogether. Not because they don't want a tidy space, but because letting go here feels like letting go of something much deeper. It's easy to believe that these items are irreplaceable because of what they represent. A letter might remind you of a relationship that shaped you. A souvenir might carry the feeling of a place you once loved. A gift might hold the presence of someone important in your life. And so, the object becomes a container for meaning. It feels as though if you let it go, the memory itself might fade with it. But when you look more closely, something subtle becomes clear. The memory isn't in the object. It never was. The object is simply a trigger, a physical cue that brings the memory to the surface. The experience itself lives within you, independent of the item. You don't need to hold on to everything in order to remember what mattered. In fact, holding on to too many of these items can dilute their significance. When everything is kept, nothing stands out. The truly meaningful pieces get lost among the many that you kept out of hesitation rather than genuine connection. What begins as preservation quietly turns into accumulation. There's also a kind of fear hidden beneath this attachment. A fear that if you let go, you might regret it later. That you might want to revisit that memory and find it gone. But this fear often assumes that your future self will need the same reminders your past self did. And that's not always true. As you grow and change, the way you relate to your past evolves as well. Some items belong to a version of you that no longer exists. They reflect a time, a mindset, a set of circumstances that have already passed. Keeping them indefinitely can create a subtle resistance to moving forward, as if part of your environment is anchored in a different chapter of your life. This doesn't mean you need to erase your past. It means choosing which parts of it you want to carry forward intentionally. A few meaningful items, kept with awareness, can feel far more powerful than boxes filled with things you rarely look at. There's a quiet practice that can help with this transition, acknowledging the role each item has played before letting it go. Not in a dramatic or ritualistic way, but in a simple, honest recognition. This object was part of your life. It served a purpose, even if that purpose was just to mark a moment in time. And now, that role is complete. When you approach it this way, letting go begins to feel less like loss and more like closure. You're not discarding something carelessly. You're completing its place in your life. That small shift in perspective can make a surprisingly large difference. Another layer that becomes visible here is how often people keep things out of guilt. Gifts are a common example. There's a sense that letting go of a gift is somehow disrespectful to the person who gave it. But that belief quietly turns your space into a storage area for other people's expectations. A gift's purpose is fulfilled the moment it is given and received. The more you let go, the easier it becomes. Not because you stop caring, but because your sensitivity sharpens. You become more aware of what truly resonates with you and what doesn't. Decisions that once felt difficult begin to feel almost obvious. Your space starts to change, not just in how it looks, but in how it feels. There's less visual noise, less friction in your daily movements, fewer small frustrations. But more importantly, there's a sense of alignment, as if your surroundings are finally reflecting who you are now, rather than who you used to be or who you thought you should become. And yet, even after you've gone through everything and made these decisions, there's still one subtle challenge left. Because creating a clear space is one thing, maintaining it without slipping back into old habits is something else entirely. That final shift doesn't come from effort or discipline in the way most people expect. It comes from something much simpler, but also much easier to overlook. What surprises most people is that once you've gone through this entire process, the question of maintenance almost disappears. Not because life becomes perfectly controlled, but because the nature of your relationship with your belongings has fundamentally changed. You're no longer managing clutter, you've removed the conditions that create it in the first place. Before this shift, putting things away often felt like a chore. You'd use something, leave it out, and tell yourself you'd deal with it later. Over time, those small moments would accumulate into disorder. But after making clear decisions about what truly belongs in your space, something subtle happens. Each item that remains has a defined place, and more importantly, a defined purpose. There's no ambiguity left. When there's no ambiguity, there's less hesitation. You don't have to think about where something goes or whether it matters. You simply return it to where it belongs. It becomes almost automatic, not because you've built a strict habit, but because the environment supports that behavior naturally. This is where the idea of a place for everything takes on a deeper meaning. It's not about rigid organization systems or perfectly labeled containers. It's about clarity. When you know exactly why you own something and where it fits in your life, its place becomes obvious. And when every item has that clarity, your space begins to maintain itself. With very little effort. There's also a noticeable shift in how you acquire new things. Before, it was easy to bring items into your life without much thought. A small purchase here, an impulsive decision there, each one seeming insignificant on its own. But now, each addition stands out. You've experienced what it takes to create a clear and intentional space, and that awareness naturally makes you more selective. You begin to ask different questions. Not just whether you like something, but whether it truly deserves a place in your environment, whether it aligns with how you want to live, or whether it will quietly become another object that demands your attention without giving much in return. This doesn't lead to deprivation or strict minimalism unless you choose that path. It simply leads to intentionality. You can still own many things, but they no longer feel excessive or burdensome, because each one has been chosen with awareness. Another interesting effect is how this change extends beyond physical objects. Once you've practiced making clear decisions about what stays and what goes in your space, it becomes easier to apply that same clarity to other areas of life. Commitments, relationships, habits, you start to notice which ones feel aligned and which ones carry unnecessary weight. It's not that everything suddenly becomes easy, but there's less tolerance for the vague, the unnecessary, and the draining. You become more comfortable letting go, not just of objects, but of anything that no longer fits who you are. There's also a sense of calm that begins to settle in, one that's difficult to describe until you experience it. It's not excitement or relief in the usual sense. It's quieter than that. A steady feeling that your environment is no longer pulling at your attention from multiple directions. That your space supports you instead of distracting you. And in that calm, something else becomes possible, a clearer awareness of what actually matters to you. When your surroundings are no longer crowded with excess, the things that remain naturally stand out. They're easier to appreciate, easier to use, and easier to care for. But perhaps the most meaningful change is how you begin to see your home itself. It stops being just a place where your things are stored. That realization brings with it a certain responsibility, not in a heavy or burdensome sense, but in a conscious one. Because once you understand that your environment is something you actively shape, it's hard to go back to living among things you didn't intentionally choose. And yet, this isn't about reaching some final, perfect state. Life continues to change, and so will your needs, your preferences, and your circumstances. The difference now is that you have a way of responding to those changes without falling back into unconscious accumulation. You know how to pause, evaluate, and decide. You know how to let things go without turning it into a struggle. And you know how to create space, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. In the end, what started as an effort to tidy up becomes something much broader. It becomes a way of engaging with your life more deliberately. A way of making sure that what surrounds you supports who you are, rather than obscuring it. And once you've experienced that kind of clarity, even briefly, it's very difficult to ignore it. At some point, you begin to notice that what once felt like a practical exercise has quietly reshaped something deeper. The visible result is a cleaner space, but the real change is less obvious. It shows up in how you move through your day, how you make decisions, and how you relate to the things, and even the people, around you. There's a certain lightness that comes from no longer being surrounded by excess. Not just physical lightness, but mental clarity. You're no longer constantly processing unfinished decisions. Before, every unopened drawer or overfilled shelf carried a small, silent demand on your attention. Now, that background noise fades. Your environment becomes quieter, and in that quiet, your thoughts become clearer too. It also changes your relationship with time. When your space is in order, daily routines become smoother. You spend less time searching, rearranging, or compensating for disorganization. Simple actions, getting dressed, preparing a meal, leaving the house, begin to flow without interruption. And while each of these moments seems small on its own, together they create a sense of ease that builds throughout the day. But what's more interesting is how your sense of value begins to shift. When you're no longer surrounded by things you don't truly care about, your sensitivity to what you do care about becomes sharper. You start to notice quality over quantity. You begin to appreciate the items you've chosen to keep, not because they're rare or expensive, but because they genuinely fit your life. This awareness often leads to a different kind of consumption. Instead of accumulating, you begin to curate. You become more patient, more selective. You're less interested in having more, and more interested in having what feels right. And this shift tends to extend beyond objects into experiences as well. You become more deliberate about how you spend your time, where you invest your energy, and what you allow into your life. There's also an unexpected sense of confidence that emerges from this process. Not the loud, outward kind, but a quieter, more grounded version. It comes from knowing that your environment reflects your choices, rather than your habits or impulses. That you're capable of making clear decisions and following through on them. That you can let go when something no longer serves you. This confidence doesn't demand attention, but it subtly influences how you carry yourself. You feel less scattered, less reactive. There's a steadiness that comes from being aligned with your surroundings, rather than constantly adjusting to them. Relationships can shift as well, sometimes in ways you don't anticipate. When your space becomes more intentional, you may find yourself wanting the same clarity in your interactions. You become more aware of what feels genuine and what feels obligatory. Just as you learn to let go of objects that no longer belong, you may begin to reconsider commitments or dynamics that feel out of place. This doesn't mean becoming distant or detached. It means becoming more honest, with yourself first, and then with others. And while that honesty can sometimes feel uncomfortable, it often leads to connections that are more meaningful and less burdened by unspoken expectations. Another subtle change is how you begin to experience gratitude. When you're surrounded by fewer things, each one becomes more visible, more noticeable, more appreciated. You're not overwhelmed by volume, so your attention naturally settles on what's in front of you. And in that attention, there's a quiet sense of appreciation that doesn't require effort. It's part of a space that supports your life. And yet, there's an important understanding that anchors all of this. The goal was never perfection. It was never about creating a space that looks a certain way or meets some external standard. It was about removing what doesn't belong so that what does can exist more clearly. Life will still change. New things will come in, old things will leave. There will be moments of disorder, periods of transition, unexpected shifts. But the difference now is that you're no longer passive in that process. You're aware, you're engaged, you're choosing. And perhaps that's the most lasting impact of all. Not the clean shelves or organized drawers, but the mindset that stays with you. The ability to pause and ask, in any area of your life, a simple but powerful question: does this truly belong here? When you live with that question, your surroundings stop being accidental. They become a reflection of intention. And over time, that intention shapes not just your space, but the way you experience your life as a whole. There's something quietly powerful about that, something that doesn't need to be announced or displayed. It simply shows up in how you live, day after day, in ways that feel both subtle and deeply transformative. And once you've experienced that shift, even in small ways, it tends to stay with you, guiding your choices long after the act of tidying itself is finished. After everything settles, what remains isn't just a clean space or a set of habits you follow out of routine. It's a different way of seeing. You begin to recognize that every object around you is part of an ongoing relationship, not something static. Things enter your life, serve a purpose, and eventually, their role comes to an end. When you understand that rhythm, you stop clinging so tightly, and you stop treating your belongings as permanent extensions of yourself. There's a quiet freedom in that realization. You no longer feel the need to hold on to things simply because they've been with you for a long time. Longevity, by itself, stops being a reason to keep something. Instead, the question becomes much simpler and more present, focused: does this still fit into the life I'm living now? And when you start living by that question, you notice how often people around you are still caught in the old pattern. Spaces filled with things they don't use, don't need, and don't even particularly like, yet feel unable to release. It becomes clear that clutter isn't really about a lack of effort. It's about a lack of clarity. Without a clear way to decide, everything defaults to keep, and over time, that default fills up entire rooms. But once you've experienced clarity, even briefly, it becomes difficult to ignore. You start to see how much energy is tied up in indecision, how much of your attention is quietly consumed by things that don't truly matter. And that awareness naturally pulls you back toward simplicity, not as a strict rule, but as a preference. There's also a shift in how you define comfort. Before, comfort might have meant having more options, more backups, more just-in-case items within reach. It felt like security. But over time, you begin to realize that too many options can create friction rather than ease. They make decisions slower, spaces heavier, and daily life more complicated than it needs to be. Real comfort starts to look different. It feels like space, not emptiness, but room to move, to think, to breathe without obstruction. It feels like knowing where things are without searching, like being surrounded only by what supports your life instead of distracting from it. This change doesn't isolate you from the world. If anything, it tends to reconnect you to it in a more grounded way. When your environment is clear, your attention is less scattered. You're more present in conversations, more aware of your surroundings, less pulled into the constant background noise of unfinished decisions. There's also a subtle but meaningful shift in how you treat the things you own. Care becomes more natural, not forced or perfectionistic, but attentive. When you have fewer things, and each one has a clear place and purpose, maintaining them becomes almost effortless. You're not overwhelmed by volume, so you can give proper attention to what remains. And interestingly, this often leads to a deeper sense of respect, not just for objects, but for the role they play in your life. You begin to see your belongings not as disposable or insignificant, but as tools, companions, or even quiet supports that make your daily routine smoother. At the same time, you become less dependent on them for identity. You no longer need your possessions to it influences your future decisions. Because you've gone through the process of letting go, not just physically, but mentally, you carry that awareness forward. When something new enters your life, you don't just ask whether you want it. You ask whether you're willing to give it space, attention, and a place in your environment. That pause, that small moment of consideration, changes everything. It prevents accumulation before it begins. It keeps your space aligned without requiring constant correction. Over time, this way of living becomes less about tidying and more about consistency. Not in the sense of rigid discipline, but in the sense of staying connected to what matters and letting everything else fall away naturally. And perhaps the most unexpected part is how calm it all feels. There's no urgency, no pressure to constantly improve or optimize. Just a steady sense that your surroundings are working with you, not against you. That your space is no longer something you need to manage, but something that quietly supports your life. In the end, the real impact isn't something dramatic or immediate. It's gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. But over time, it reshapes how you live in ways that are difficult to reverse. You become more aware, more intentional, and more at ease with both having and letting go. And once that balance settles in, you realize that what you've created isn't just a tidy home. It's a space that allows you to live with less resistance, a space that reflects not just what you own, but how you choose to live. What lingers after all of this isn't a set of rules you need to remember, but a kind of quiet awareness that stays in the background of your life. You don't walk through your home thinking about tidying anymore. You simply notice when something feels out of place, and you understand why. That understanding is what keeps everything in balance, not effort or discipline. There's a difference now in how you respond to disorder. Before, it might have felt frustrating or overwhelming, like something that required time and energy you didn't have. Now, it's smaller, more manageable. A single item left out doesn't spiral into a larger mess, because it no longer blends into an environment that was already cluttered. It stands out clearly, and that clarity makes it easy to address in the moment. This might seem like a small change, but it shifts the entire dynamic. You're no longer reacting to clutter after it builds up. You're preventing it without even thinking about it. And that creates a sense of stability that most people never quite experience, because they're always cycling between disorder and cleanup. There's also a deeper trust that develops, trust in your own decisions. You've gone through the process of choosing what stays and what goes with honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. And because of that, you stop second-guessing yourself as much. You don't feel the need to revisit the same decisions over and over again. That trust extends into how you live more broadly. When you're faced with choices, whether they're small or significant, you have a clearer sense of what aligns with you and what doesn't. You're less likely to hold on to things, or situations, out of habit or uncertainty. You've practiced letting go, and that practice stays with you. There's also a noticeable shift in how your space influences your mood. Before, it might have been something you barely paid attention to, even though it affected you constantly. Now, the connection is clearer. You can feel the difference between a space that supports you and one that drains your energy. And because you've experienced that difference, you're less willing to tolerate environments that feel heavy or chaotic, whether they're your own or someone else's. Not in a judgmental way, but in a personal, grounded sense of preference. You begin to seek out spaces, and by extension, experiences, that feel clear, intentional, and calm. This doesn't mean your life becomes minimal or empty. In fact, it often becomes richer, but in a different way. Instead of being filled with excess, it becomes filled with things that actually matter to you. Objects, experiences, relationships, all chosen with a level of awareness that wasn't there before. And when everything around you has that quality, even ordinary moments begin to feel different. Making a cup of tea, sitting down to work, getting ready in the morning, these simple actions become smoother, less interrupted. There's less friction between you and what you're doing. That reduction in friction creates space for something else, attention. You're able to be more present, not because you're trying to be, but because there's less pulling your focus than that. It's about maintaining a sense of alignment, making small adjustments when needed, and allowing your space to evolve alongside you without losing its clarity. You might also notice that your definition of enough begins to shift. Before, enough might have felt distant, something just out of reach, always requiring a little more. More space, more things, more organization. But now, enough feels present. It's something you can recognize in your current environment, not something you're constantly chasing. And that recognition brings a kind of contentment that isn't dependent on adding anything new. It comes from seeing clearly what's already there and knowing that it's sufficient. In the end, what you've built isn't just an organized space. It's a relationship with your surroundings that's based on clarity, intention, and trust. A relationship where things enter and leave naturally, without creating tension or confusion. And perhaps the most important part is this: you can return to this state whenever you need to. Life will change, circumstances will shift, and your space may evolve in ways you don't expect. But the awareness you've developed doesn't disappear. It stays with you, quietly guiding your decisions. So even if things become temporarily messy again, you are no longer starting from zero. You know how to see clearly, you know how to choose, and you know how to let go. And once you truly understand that, tidying stops being something you do, and becomes something you live. In the end, what stays with you isn't the memory of what you discarded, but the feeling of what you chose to keep. That distinction matters more than it first appears. Because over time, your life begins to reflect those choices in ways that go far beyond your physical surroundings. You start to notice that clarity isn't something you achieve once and hold onto forever. It's something you return to, again and again, in small, quiet ways. Not through big, exhausting efforts, but through simple moments of awareness. A drawer that begins to feel slightly crowded. A shelf that no longer feels quite right. A purchase you pause to reconsider before bringing it into your space. These moments are subtle, almost easy to overlook, but they are where the real transformation continues to happen. Because each time you notice and respond with intention, you reinforce the way of living you've created. You keep your environment aligned without needing to reset everything from scratch. There's also a growing sense of ease in how you move through change. Before, change might have felt disruptive. New phases of life often meant new things, new clutter, new adjustments that slowly built into disorder. But now, you approach change differently. You are more willing to adapt your space as your life evolves, rather than letting it accumulate around outdated needs or identities. This flexibility is what keeps everything sustainable. It allows your environment to remain a reflection of your present, not a storage space for your past or a placeholder for your imagined future. You may also begin to notice how this clarity affects your decisions beyond your home. There's a natural alignment that starts to carry into your work, your schedule, even your goals. You become less interested in filling your time with things that don't feel meaningful, just as you became less interested in filling your space with objects that don't belong. This doesn't mean you become rigid or overly selective. It means you become honest. Honest about what you have the energy for, what you genuinely value, and what no longer fits. And that honesty simplifies things in a way that effort alone never could. There's a certain calm confidence in that simplicity. You are no longer trying to keep up with an invisible standard or maintain a version of life that doesn't quite feel like yours. Instead, you are shaping things in a way that feels natural and sustainable. And perhaps one of the most unexpected shifts is how your sense of satisfaction changes. It becomes less tied to acquiring or achieving, and more connected to maintaining alignment. There's a quiet satisfaction in looking around your space and feeling that everything there has a reason to be there, that nothing is demanding your attention unnecessarily. This satisfaction isn't loud or dramatic. It doesn't need to be shared or validated. It's personal, almost private. And because of that, it tends to last longer than the fleeting excitement of something new. At the same time, you become more open to letting things go when their time has passed. Not with hesitation, but with a kind of understanding. You recognize that holding on too tightly can turn even good things into sources of friction. That rhythm, there's less resistance. You're not constantly adjusting to clutter or overwhelmed by excess. You're simply responding to what feels right in the moment, guided by the clarity you've built. Over time, this way of living becomes second nature. You don't think of it as a method or a system anymore. It's just how you interact with your environment, how you make decisions, how you move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. And when you look back, you realize that what seemed like a simple act of tidying was never really about organizing things. It was about learning how to choose, clearly, honestly, and without hesitation. Because once you learn how to choose in that way, it changes more than your space. It changes how you live. What becomes clear, after living this way for some time, is that the real value was never in having less or more. It was in understanding your relationship with what you have. That understanding quietly reshapes everything, because it removes the unconscious patterns that once guided your choices. Before, many of your decisions around possessions were automatic. You bought things without much thought, kept them without much evaluation, and stored them without much awareness. It wasn't intentional, but it was consistent. And over time, that consistency created a space that felt slightly out of sync with you. Now, there's a pause where there used to be momentum. A small moment of awareness before something enters your life, and another before something stays longer than it should. That pause is where everything changes. It gives you the chance to choose, instead of simply continuing old patterns. And what's interesting is that this doesn't slow your life down in a negative way. It actually makes things feel smoother, because you're no longer dealing with the consequences of accumulated, unexamined decisions. You're making fewer, clearer choices, and living with them more comfortably. There's also a deeper sense of ownership that develops, not in the sense of possession, but in responsibility. You begin to see that everything in your space is there because of you. Not by accident, not by default, but by choice, whether conscious or unconscious. That realization can feel heavy at first, but it quickly becomes empowering. Because if your space is the result of your decisions, then it's also something you can reshape at any time. You're not stuck with it. You're not managing something outside of your control. You're actively creating it. This perspective removes a lot of the frustration people often feel toward their environment. Instead of blaming the mess or feeling overwhelmed by it, you understand it. And when you understand it, you know how to change it without turning it into a struggle. Another shift that emerges is how you experience desire. Before, wanting something new often felt immediate and convincing. It created a sense of urgency, as if acting on it would improve your life in a meaningful way. But now, that feeling is easier to question. You start to see that many desires are temporary. They come from mood, influence, or habit rather than genuine need or alignment. And when you give them a little time, many of them fade on their own. What remains tends to be more stable, more considered, and ultimately more satisfying. This doesn't mean you stop wanting things. It means your wants become more intentional. You choose them, rather than being pulled by them. There's also a noticeable change in how you relate to space itself. Empty space, which might have once felt uncomfortable or incomplete, begins to feel valuable. Not because it's empty, but because of what it allows. It creates room for movement, for clarity, for a sense of ease that crowded environments can't provide. You begin to appreciate that not every surface needs to be filled, not every corner needs to serve a purpose. Space itself becomes part of your environment, something you protect, rather than something you try to eliminate. And with that, your definition of richness starts to shift. It's no longer about how much you have, but about how well what you have fits into your life. A single object that feels right can bring more satisfaction than many that don't. And that changes how you measure value in a very fundamental way. This way of living also tends to reduce a certain kind of fatigue that often goes unnoticed. The fatigue of constant, low-level decision-making. When your space is cluttered, every interaction requires a bit more thought, a bit more effort. Over time, that adds up. But when your environment is clear, those small decisions disappear. You know where things are. You know what you have. You know what matters. And that frees a line than you realized at the time. And yet, there's no sense of rigidity in this new way of living. It's not about maintaining a perfect state or avoiding any kind of disorder. It's about staying connected to what matters, and allowing everything else to come and go without resistance. In that sense, the process never truly ends. It simply becomes part of how you live, a quiet, ongoing practice of choosing, adjusting, and letting go. And once that becomes natural, you realize that the true impact was never about your home alone. It was about creating a life that feels lighter, clearer, and more fully your own. After all of this settles into your life, something almost unnoticeable begins to take root, a sense that you are no longer carrying things you don't need, not just in your space, but within yourself. It's subtle at first. There's no dramatic moment where everything feels different. But gradually, you realize that the background weight you once lived with is gone. It used to show up in small ways. A slight resistance before starting your day. A quiet feeling of being behind, even when nothing urgent was happening. A sense that there was always something unfinished, something waiting for your attention. Much of that came not from your responsibilities, but from your environment, from being surrounded by decisions you hadn't fully made. Now, that weight has lifted. Not because your life is simpler in every way, but because it's clearer. You're no longer navigating through layers of excess, physical or mental. You're moving through a space that reflects your choices, and that alignment creates a kind of ease that's hard to replicate any other way. What's interesting is that this ease doesn't make you passive. It makes you more engaged. When your environment stops draining your attention, you have more of it available for what actually matters to you. Your focus becomes sharper, your actions more deliberate, and your time feels less fragmented. You may also notice that your tolerance for clutter, in all its forms, continues to decrease. Not in a rigid or obsessive way, but in a quiet, personal sense. You simply prefer clarity now. You prefer spaces, situations, and even conversations that feel intentional rather than scattered or excessive. This preference begins to guide your life in ways you don't have to force. You naturally move toward environments that support you in a way. From those that don't. You choose more carefully what you bring into your home, your schedule, and your attention. And yet, there's also a kind of softness in this way of living. You're not trying to control everything. You understand that life will always include some level of disorder, unpredictability, and change. The difference is that you no longer let those things accumulate unnoticed. When something starts to feel off, you recognize it earlier. You adjust more easily. You let go more willingly. There's less buildup, less friction, less need for drastic resets. In a way, you've shifted from reacting to your life to shaping it, gently and consistently. There's also a deeper appreciation for the present that begins to emerge. When your surroundings are no longer filled with distractions or unresolved decisions, it becomes easier to simply be where you are. You're not constantly pulled into what needs to be fixed, organized, or dealt with later. This presence doesn't require effort. It's a natural result of removing what was in the way. And from that place, even ordinary moments begin to feel more complete. Sitting in a quiet room, using something you truly value, moving through your day without unnecessary interruption, these experiences carry a kind of satisfaction that isn't dependent on anything extra. Over time, you may find that your definition of a well-lived life starts to change. It becomes less about accumulation, achievement, or constant improvement, and more about alignment. About living in a way where your surroundings, your actions, and your values feel connected rather than scattered. That doesn't mean you stop growing or striving. It means your growth becomes more intentional. You're no longer adding things, or commitments, just for the sake of progress. You're choosing them because they genuinely fit the direction you want your life to take. And that makes your path feel clearer, even if it's not always easy. In the end, what began as a simple act of tidying reveals itself as something much deeper. It becomes a way of understanding yourself through your choices. A way of shaping your environment so that it supports, rather than competes with, the life you want to live. You realize that every object you keep, every space you create, every decision you make, foundation of everything. What you begin to understand, after everything has settled into place, is that nothing about this was really about tidying in the ordinary sense. It only appeared that way at the beginning. What you were actually doing was learning how to relate to your life with clarity, instead of habit. Because if you look closely, clutter was never just about objects. It was about postponed decisions. Things you didn't fully choose, but didn't fully release either. And when too many of those decisions build up, they create a kind of quiet tension that sits in the background of your life. Now, that tension is gone. Not because everything is perfect, but because very little is left undecided. You've practiced choosing, clearly, honestly, and without unnecessary delay. And that practice changes how you approach almost everything. You no longer rely on, someday, as much as you used to. That vague idea of a future moment when things will become useful, relevant, or meaningful loses its hold. You start to see things in the present, as they are, rather than as they might be. And that shift brings a kind of honesty that simplifies your life in ways you didn't expect. You stop holding on to possibilities that don't align with your current reality. You stop keeping things just to avoid discomfort. You stop filling your space, and your time, with things that don't have a clear place in your life. This honesty isn't harsh. It's actually freeing, because it removes the pressure to maintain versions of your life that no longer fit. There's also a deeper sense of trust that continues to grow. Not just trust in your decisions, but trust in your ability to handle change. You've already experienced letting go, many times over, and you've seen that it doesn't lead to loss in the way you once feared. If anything, it creates space, and that space often leads to something better aligned, more useful, or more meaningful entering your life. This makes you less defensive, less attached, less hesitant. You are more open to change because you are no longer trying to hold everything in place. And with that openness comes a kind of stability that isn't dependent on having everything fixed or controlled. It comes from knowing you can adjust when needed, without turning it into a struggle. Another subtle shift is how you experience ownership. Before, ownership might have felt like responsibility in a heavy sense, something you had to manage, organize, and keep under control. Now, it feels lighter. You own fewer things, or at least fewer unnecessary things, and that changes the weight of that responsibility. Everything you have now feels intentional. And because of that, it's easier to care for, easier to maintain, and easier to appreciate. You are no longer surrounded by things that quietly ask for your attention without giving anything back. What remains feels balanced. It contributes to your life instead of complicating it. This balance also changes how you experience your home. It stops feeling like a place you need to constantly fix or improve, and starts feeling like a place that supports you as you are. There's a sense of completion in that, not in the sense that nothing will ever change, but in the sense that nothing feels out of place or unresolved. And that feeling carries into how you see yourself as well. You are no longer defined by what you own, what you might become, or what you haven't done yet. There's less pressure to hold on to identities that don't fully fit. You are simply where you are, with what you've chosen to keep around you. And that creates a kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need reinforcement. It's not about having the right things or the perfect space. It's about alignment, the sense that your environment reflects your reality, not your hesitation. Over time, this alignment becomes something you protect, not through strict rules, but through awareness. You notice when something starts to feel unnecessary. You recognize when something no longer fits, and you respond before it turns into clutter again. So the process continues, but it's no longer overwhelming. It's just part of how you live. And when you step back and look at it, you realize that what changed wasn't your space alone. It was your relationship with everything you allow into your life. Because in the end, every choice, in the quiet after everything has been sorted, chosen, and settled, there's a realization that feels almost understated, yet it changes how you see everything going forward. You begin to understand that what you've really created is not just a physical environment, but a kind of inner standard, a way of recognizing what belongs in your life and what does not. This standard isn't something rigid or fixed. It's flexible, but clear. It doesn't demand perfection, and it doesn't require constant attention. It simply exists in the background, guiding your decisions in a way that feels natural rather than forced. Before, it was easy to ignore that inner sense, to override it with logic, with habit, or with the opinions and expectations of others. You might have kept things because they were expensive, because they were gifted, because they might be useful someday, or simply because letting go felt uncomfortable. Now, that internal signal is harder to ignore. You recognize the subtle difference between something that truly fits into your life and something that doesn't. And once you see that difference clearly, it becomes difficult to justify keeping what feels out of place. This doesn't make you strict. It makes you honest. There's also a growing sense of respect, not just for your belongings, but for your space itself. You begin to see your home as something that deserves care and intention, not as a place where things simply accumulate over time. That respect shows up in small ways. In how you put things back after using them. In how you choose where something belongs. In how you hesitate before bringing something new into your space. These actions are quiet, almost invisible, but they reinforce everything you've built. They keep your environment aligned without requiring effort or discipline in the traditional sense. And perhaps more importantly, they reflect how you see yourself. Because when you treat your space with care, you are also acknowledging that your environment matters, that your daily experience matters. You are no longer treating your surroundings as something secondary or unimportant. You are recognizing that they shape how you feel, how you think, and how you live. There's also a deeper acceptance that begins to take hold. You stop trying to create a life that looks a certain way from the outside, and instead focus on how it feels from within. Your space doesn't need to impress anyone. It doesn't need to follow trends or meet external standards. It simply needs to support you. And when it does, there's a kind of quiet satisfaction that doesn't depend on validation. It's enough that it works for you. This shift often removes a surprising amount of pressure. You are no longer chasing an ideal. You are maintaining a reality that feels right. At the same time, you remain open to change, to growth, to new experiences and new needs. But that openness is grounded in awareness. You are not adding things blindly or holding on to them out of habit. You are choosing, again and again, in small ways that shape your life over time. And that's where the real power of all of this lies. Not in the act of tidying itself, but in the mindset it creates. A mindset where you are aware of what you allow into your life. Where you are comfortable letting go when something no longer fits. Where you trust your ability to shape your surroundings in a way that supports you. This mindset doesn't stay confined to your home. It follows you into everything. Your work, your relationships, your decisions about how you spend your time and energy. It becomes part of how you live. And when you reach that point, there's nothing more you need to add to complete the process. Because it's no longer a process in the traditional sense. It's a perspective, one that continues to guide you quietly, without effort, without pressure. You don't need to start over. You don't need to keep searching for better methods or systems. After living with this awareness for a while, something even deeper begins to settle in. A sense that your life is no longer crowded by things that don't truly belong to you. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. It's as if you've cleared a path, and now you can finally see where you are going without constant distraction. There's a quiet kind of independence that comes with this. You are less influenced by what others are doing, buying, or valuing, not because you are resisting it, but because you've developed a clearer sense of what actually fits your life. That clarity acts like a filter. It allows certain things in and lets others pass without much effort. Before, it was easy to absorb external expectations without realizing it. Trends, social pressure, even subtle comparisons, they all had a way of shaping your choices. You might have bought things you didn't need, kept things you didn't like, or held on to ideas about who you should be. Now, there's more distance between you and those influences. You can see them, but you are not automatically pulled in. You are able to pause and ask yourself whether something genuinely resonates with you or whether it's just noise. This creates a kind of steadiness that isn't easily disrupted. Your decisions feel more grounded, less reactive. You are no longer constantly adjusting your life to match something outside of you. And with that steadiness comes a deeper sense of ease. You are not managing as much, not juggling as many unnecessary things. Your attention isn't divided in the same way it used to be. There's more space, not just in your home, but in your thinking. That space allows for something important, reflection. You begin to notice patterns in your life more clearly. What works, what doesn't, what feels right, what feels off. And because you are not overwhelmed by excess, you actually have the capacity to respond to those observations. This is where growth becomes more natural, not forced or driven by pressure, but guided by awareness. You are not trying to become something else. You are simply adjusting, refining, and moving closer to what already feels aligned. There's also a shift in how you experience satisfaction. It becomes less tied to having or achieving more, and more connected to maintaining this sense of alignment. You start to value consistency over intensity. Small, steady choices that keep your life clear and manageable. And that changes your pace. You are no longer rushing in the same way. There's less urgency to fill every space, to chase every opportunity, to respond to every impulse. You move more deliberately, with a kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you don't need everything. This doesn't make your life smaller, it makes it more focused. You begin to invest more fully in what you choose to keep, whether it's an object, a relationship, or a commitment. Because there's less competing for your attention, what remains naturally receives more of it. And that depth often leads to a greater sense of fulfillment than breadth ever could. Another subtle change is how you handle uncertainty. Before, holding on to things, just in case, might have felt like a way to prepare for the unknown. But now, you trust yourself more than you trust those backups. You understand that if something is truly needed later, you'll find a way to handle it. You don't need to carry every possible solution with you at all times. This trust reduces a lot of quiet anxiety. You are not constantly preparing for scenarios that may never happen. You are more present, more adaptable, and more at ease with not having everything figured out in advance. And that ease changes how you experience the future. It no longer feels like something you need to control or prepare for in every detail. It becomes something you can move into with clarity, knowing that you'll adjust as needed. When you look around your space now, it feels different. Not just because it's organized, but because it's intentional. Every item, every corner, every choice reflects a level of awareness that wasn't there before. And that awareness doesn't fade. It becomes part of how you see everything. So even as life continues to change, as new things enter and old things leave, you are no longer starting from scratch. You are continuing from a place of clarity. Over time, what becomes most noticeable is not what you've removed, but what has quietly emerged in its place. There's a steadiness to your life now, a kind of grounded clarity that doesn't fluctuate with small disruptions. It isn't something you actively maintain. It's simply there, built from all the choices you've made with awareness. You begin to realize that clarity has a compounding effect. Each intentional decision makes the next one easier. Each time you choose what truly belongs, you strengthen your ability to recognize it again. What once required effort now feels almost instinctive. This instinct doesn't come from rules or systems. It comes from experience. You've seen what happens when you hold on to things unnecessarily. You felt the weight of it, even if you couldn't fully name it at the time. And now you've also experienced the opposite, the lightness, the ease, the quiet sense of alignment that follows when you let go of what no longer fits. That contrast stays with you. It becomes a kind of internal reference point. So when something begins to feel slightly off, a space becoming crowded, an item no longer being used, a commitment that feels heavier than it should, you notice it earlier. You don't wait until it becomes overwhelming. You adjust while it's still small. This is what keeps everything sustainable. Not effort, but awareness applied consistently over time. There's also a growing appreciation for simplicity, but not in the way it's often portrayed. It's not about stripping everything down or living with the bare minimum. It's about removing what's unnecessary so that what remains can function clearly. Simplicity, in this sense, feels supportive. It reduces friction. It allows your life to flow without constant interruption or adjustment. And once you experience that kind of flow, it becomes something you naturally protect. You may also notice that your standards have changed, quietly but significantly. Not in a perfectionist sense, but in a personal one. You're less willing to tolerate things that feel out of place, whether in your environment or in your routines. This isn't about control. It's about alignment. When something doesn't fit, you don't ignore it the way you might have before. You recognize it, and you respond. Sometimes that means letting go. Sometimes it means adjusting. But either way, you don't leave it unresolved. And that habit, of not leaving things unresolved, begins to shape your life in a deeper way. It reduces the buildup of small tensions. It prevents the slow accumulation of things that don't quite belong. It keeps your environment, and by extension your mind, clear and manageable. There's also a subtle shift in how you relate to effort. Before, maintaining order might have felt like work, something you had to keep up with. Now, it feels lighter. Not because you're doing more, but because there's less to manage. You've removed the excess, and with it, the need for constant correction. This creates a sense of ease that carries through your day. You're not interrupted as often by small inconveniences. You're not adjusting around clutter or navigating through disorganization. Your space supports your actions instead of slowing them down. And in that support, your energy is preserved. That energy can then go toward things that actually matter to you, your work, your relationships, your interests. Things that add value, rather than things that simply take up space. There's also a deeper sense of contentment that begins to stabilize. Not excitement, not temporary satisfaction, but a steady feeling that your life is in order in a way that feels right to you. It's not dependent on external conditions. It comes from the alignment between what you have, what you do, and what you value. And because of that, it doesn't fluctuate as easily. Even when life becomes busy or unpredictable, that underlying clarity remains. You may have moments of disorder, but they don't take over. They don't linger long enough to become overwhelming. You know how to return to balance, because you've done it before. And that knowledge removes a lot of the fear that often surrounds change or disruption. You're no longer trying to avoid disorder at all costs. You're simply confident in your ability to move through it and restore clarity when needed. In the end, what you've built is not a perfect environment, but a resilient one. A space, and a way of living, that can adapt without losing its sense of alignment. And that resilience, in the long run, what truly stays with you is not the memory of how you organized your space, but the quiet shift in how you experience your life within it. The process fades into the background, but its effects remain woven into your daily rhythm. You no longer think about tidying as something separate from living. It has blended into the way you move, choose, and respond. There's no clear line where one ends and the other begins. And that's when you realize the transformation is complete, not because everything is perfect, but because nothing feels out of place for long. There's a certain ease in waking up and stepping into a space that doesn't demand anything from you. Nothing is pulling at your attention unnecessarily. Nothing is waiting to be dealt with in the background. Your environment feels settled, and that sense of stability carries into how you begin your day. It's a small thing, but it changes the tone of everything that follows. You move with less resistance. Decisions feel lighter. Even your energy feels more available, because it isn't being quietly drained by unfinished business or excess. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to trust that this state isn't temporary. It's not something you have to constantly rebuild or fight to maintain. It's something you know how to return to, naturally, whenever things start to shift. That trust removes a subtle layer of anxiety that many people carry without realizing it, the fear that things will eventually fall apart again. You've seen that they don't have to. You've experienced a different way of living, one that doesn't rely on constant correction. This creates a kind of calm confidence that becomes part of your foundation. You also start to notice that your sense of identity has become less tied to what you own. There's less need to express yourself through accumulation, less pressure to hold on to things as proof of who you are or who you've been. Instead, your identity feels more internal, more stable. Your surroundings reflect you, but they don't define you. And that separation brings a quiet freedom. You are no longer managing your life through your possessions. You are simply using what you need, appreciating what you have, and letting go of what no longer fits, without turning it into something heavy or emotional. This lightness carries into how you approach the future as well. You are less concerned with preparing for every possibility, less focused on holding on to things, just in case. You trust your ability to adapt when the time comes. You know that you can make decisions when they're needed, rather than trying to solve everything in advance. That trust simplifies your life in a way that's difficult to explain until you experience it. It removes the need for excess. It replaces it with clarity. And in that clarity, your life begins to feel more direct, less layered, less complicated, less weighed down by things that don't truly serve you. There's also a deeper appreciation for the present that continues to grow. When your space is clear and aligned, it doesn't pull you away from the moment you are in. It supports it. You can sit, work, rest, or think without being subtly interrupted by your surroundings. And that uninterrupted presence makes even ordinary moments feel more complete. Over time, this becomes your normal. Not something you think about, not something you strive for, just the way your life feels. And when you look back, it's almost surprising how something as simple as choosing what to keep and what to let go could lead to this kind of shift. But it makes sense when you see it clearly, because every object you removed was a decision you finally made. Every item you kept was something you chose with intention. And together, those decisions reshaped not just your space, but your relationship with everything around you. In the end, that's what remains. A life where your surroundings support you instead of distracting you. Where your choices feel clear instead of delayed. Where your space reflects who you are now, not who you used to be or who you thought you might become. And once you've experienced that, even quietly, it doesn't leave you. It becomes part of how you live, steady, simple, and entirely your own.